Good morning, everybody. My name is Anna Webster. I'm an honors student here at Lone Star College-Kingwood, and today I'm going to be presenting my research for Honors Federal Government, A Fair Go at Free Speech, How Ranked Choice Voting Affects Campaign Rhetoric in Federal Elections. Now, in modern democracies, the way that politicians campaign is a reflection of modern politics. Campaign rhetoric often reflects what it is that politicians need in order to win. And in places like Australia, where they use something called ranked choice voting to elect their representatives, what they need to win might look just a little bit different than it does here in the United States. Which brings me to my research question. To what extent did the electoral systems used in the United States and Australia influence campaign rhetoric in televised advertisements during the 1966, 2004, and 2016 election cycles? Now, we all know what plurality voting is, whether we think we do or not. It's the voting system that we use here in the United States today. You either vote for one person or you vote for the other. Your vote can't count twice. But ranked choice voting is just a little bit different than that. Instead of voting for one candidate, voters instead rank their candidates according to their preferences. So their first choice, second choice, third choice, and so on. And all a candidate needs to win is 50% of the first choice votes. As you can see with this diagram, candidate A has passed the 50% threshold, and then they would be elected. But let's say hypothetically that the votes were just a little bit more evenly dispersed, and no candidate hits the 50% mark. What happens then? Well, the candidate with the lowest number of first choice votes would be promptly eliminated from the race, and their votes would then be redistributed to the other candidates based on those voters' second choice votes. Now, if we do this and still no candidate has met the 50% mark, then this process would repeat until a candidate passes that 50% threshold, and then they would be elected. Now, what do current scholars have to say about ranked choice voting? A lot of them talk about how it uplifts third parties in predominantly two-party systems, and others talk about it's a better, more democratic representation of what the people actually want. But the main two scholars that I want to look at for my research mainly discussed the effects that ranked choice voting actually has on campaign civility. The first study that I want to look at surveyed voters living in cities in the United States that use plurality voting for their local elections, and then cities in the United States that use preferential or ranked choice voting in their local elections. And this study was really to measure the public's perception of the campaigns run in that city, whether or not ranked choice voting cities were considered having more civil campaigns or not. And so the results of this study concluded that voters were significantly more satisfied with the conduct of candidates in preferential cities over plurality cities, and that they were very much less likely to view the campaigns as negative. The second study actually builds off of the first one, but this time instead uses text analysis software to compare candidates' tweets and also newspaper articles in both plurality and preferential cities. And this study had similar findings. They concluded that one, candidates were more engaging with their constituents overall in ranked choice voting cities, and that news articles published in ranked choice voting cities contained more words with positive connotations. And so they concluded that ranked choice voting cities did promote a more civil style of campaigning. These two studies really influenced the basis of my hypothesis, was that because Australia has used ranked choice voting for decades, we can expect to see more civil style of campaigning and rhetoric that's centered around appealing to broader groups of people, and that we would see the opposite in the United States. And so for my methodology, I utilized a qualitative comparative analysis using a most similar systems design method, comparing Australian and United States elections across those 3 years that I mentioned, comparing advertisements from both candidates from both parties in each of those elections. And then those advertisements I then subjected to a coding process to identify any sort of reoccurring rhetorical strategies. And then this is just a glimpse of that coding process. I analyzed advertisements for varying tones, framing, and also narrative structures. You see the ones that I have highlighted right there, a positive tone and a more collective narrative structure. Those are the two that I anticipated to see more in the Australian campaign ads, because those are typically more associated with ranked choice voting, that more civil style of campaigning. Moving on to my results. In 1996, in Australia, we saw that the Liberal Party very consistently used issue-based, very negative advertising. It was aimed mainly at criticizing the Labour Party's policies from the previous administration. Whereas the Labour Party had more of like a mixed tone, did use a little bit more value framing, had some individual narratives sprinkled in there, but it was mainly that collective narrative that dominated. Whereas in the United States, we saw that the Republican candidate Dole used very, very strong negative personal attacks against his opponent Clinton, whereas Clinton had more of a mix of positive and contrastive appeals. But really what I want to highlight here is the gap in tone from these two candidates, kind of signaling the very, very earliest decline of civility in campaigning as far as the ones that I analyzed, and highlighting the polarization that we would see very heavy on later. And in 2004, in Australia, we saw that the Liberal Party, from the very few ads that they did have published to YouTube, all of them were coded basically the same way. They all were very, very issue-focused, focusing on negative attacks on the Labour Party's economic management or lack thereof. Whereas the Labour Party had more of a mix of tones. Value framing, when it was used more to differ between the candidates. And then narratives were mostly collective, like the previous election year. Whereas in the United States, both candidates actually heavily used negative and contrastive rhetoric. We saw a higher prevalence of personality framing, basically attacking their opponent's competence, their authenticity, and their leadership styles. When issue framing was used, it was used primarily to contrast between candidates rather than actually debate policy. And then in 2016, finally, the Liberal Party did continue their issue-centered attacks. Very, very minimal personality framing was present throughout the advertisements, whereas the Labour Party, even though they did maintain more diverse tones, they still had very issue-based messaging. But overall, collective narratives dominated in this election, showing that the messaging was intended for much broader audiences. And then in 2016 in America, we saw that the Republican candidate Trump had overwhelmingly attack-based, very individualistic advertising style that was targeting the personality of his opponent, whereas Democratic candidate Clinton used primarily contrastive, occasionally positive tone to kind of contrast her opponent, really. And that's the same thing that she did with the more collective narratives. So appealing to America as a whole, in contrast with her opponent's very, very individualistic style of campaigning. But we did really see a clear peak of polarization and negativity with these results. Overall, the results do indicate that electoral systems do, to a degree, shape campaign rhetoric. We saw, based on the results of those American elections, that the campaigns typically reward individualistic leadership appeals, and they gain more traction mobilizing base supporters over trying to rally the larger coalitions. Whereas in Australia, those campaigns promote definitely more issue-based messaging aimed at wider bipartisan audiences. And then, of course, the overall global shift towards negativity we saw with both Australia and the United States, which I think could indicate, like I said, a global shift towards more polarization just within Western politics in general. So some limitations to my research that I do want to bring up. So the ad samples that I did analyze were all limited to YouTube. So obviously not all advertisements available within that election cycle would be accessible to the public. And so that kind of made it so that some of my sample sizes were just a little bit smaller than I would have liked, which does make it risky for generalizations with some of the conclusions that I came to. And also the coding coding criteria that I used is inherently interpretive, as uniform as I tried to apply it. But nevertheless, future research might include expanding on the advertisement sources that I had. So, going outside of YouTube, increasing the sample sizes. So looking at more years, different countries maybe, or even third parties. And then if I had access to them, use of the linguistic tools like we saw in the CROAK 2021 study. These are my references. Thank you.